session. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
You mentioned, I think earlier, in the earlier session, that you seem to go in that direction, that anti-Semitism showed its head in terms of attacking Jews because they're Jews, and then attacking Jews because of Israel, or using Israel as the lightning rod. So, in what I've read, I think what you've written in the past, I was able to see that, or determine that there was a point in time in the early years, we'll say maybe the Spanish Inquisition, or whatever, those years when Jews were attacked because of their religion, and then in the 20th century, prior to 48, they were attacked for their peoplehood, and then after 48, they were attacked for their country. And that's the best I can do to explain it to students. So can you elaborate on how I might expand on that?
So there's a lot of literature, right? There's the emergence of literature. Carlton put the books up, so thank you. So I think in the conference that we organized, Global Anti-Semitism, The Crisis of Modernity, we have a 5-volume set here that's relatively cheap. You can get it on Amazon for like $9 a volume. And the Yale papers are also about $20. So I think there's literature from serious young and elder scholars. Elders in the most positive sense. From an interdisciplinary perspective. So I think there's good material here. Some of it is on the levels of social theory, the Arab world, case studies, and the like. So I think this is a good source. And the scholars some of the scholars in here have done excellent work in other places. So it's a good beginning point. And I think to focus on the contemporary, I think during the week, Dan and others are going to deal with the history. But I think the one point that I wanted to drive home is the demonization of Israel and Zionism. Many people in the West thought that this was a problem for the Israelis. The Israelis would sort out the conflict in the region, and everything will be okay. And I think what we've seen is becoming very clear is that as Israel becomes demonized, as the Jewish narrative of peoplehood becomes critiqued on the one hand by, say, the Arab nationalists and Islamism, and on the other hand by sort of this postmodern, Michel Foucaultian, forgive me for my this is Rubin here, with lots of references, kind of the Edward Saidi and Middle East Studies assessment. As Israel is delegitimized, Jewish diaspora communities with a strong connection to this delegitimized density are also becoming victimized by this new anti-Semitism, the contemporary anti-Semitism. I don't like the term new anti-Semitism. And I think certainly in France and Belgium, the United Kingdom, and increasingly at an alarming rate in the United States, I think Iran nuclear agreement, there's an upsurge of anti-Semitism on the ground in reality, in statistics, and there's also in terms of discourse and ideology in public policy. There's a shift. I spoke in the United Nations on Yom HaShoah, and Kerry the day before had said that Israel runs the danger of becoming an apartheid state. So if Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal human rights perspective, we would be morally obligated to dismantle it. We have to be clear. So when the Secretary of State, on the eve of Yom HaShoah, says that Israel could become an apartheid state, and of course there are intellectuals who argue that it already is, a fascist state, an apartheid state. This discourse, the delegitimization, I would argue, is very dangerous, not just for Israel, but for Jews in the diaspora. And we see the attacks in North America on Jews on campus, and this is where the future leaders are groomed. This is where the next generation is reared. So this should be taken very seriously by scholars from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I think to back it up with science, and not just social theoretical analysis, or discourse analysis, So when the United States of America are alarmed at the potential of an apartheid Israel, but they're legitimizing the Iranian revolutionary regime or engaging the Muslim Brotherhood or remaining silent, if not aiding and abetting the revolution as we speak in Turkey. This is extraordinarily dangerous at so many levels. In 2008, I believe, Ed Kaplan at Yale and myself wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution where we interviewed 5,000 people in 10 European countries. And we asked them a series of questions about classical forms of anti-Semitism. The Jews stick to themselves, Jews control the economy, Jews are cheaters in business, the good old stuff. And we asked them a series of questions about Israel. Israel's an apartheid state, Israel's a racist state, the IDF intentionally shoots children, the Israelis poison the water of Palestinians, which Abbas just said at the United Nations, no less. And so this old libel, this old anti-Semitic trope that Abbas is using. So we asked them a series of questions, and we called this sort of Israel bashing, not anti-Zionism, because I think you can be anti-Zionist or anti-nationalist and not necessarily be an anti-Semite. So we call this Israel bashing. And what we found in the 10 European countries is that levels of anti-Semitism and Israel bashing are relatively low. They're high among the Muslim immigrant population, something that the journal refused to allow us to publish. They removed that fact, which is interesting. Today they wouldn't, but in 2008 they did, which is interesting. So we had a choice. Remove the fact that Muslim immigrants in Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom are disproportionately anti-Semitic, or we don't publish. And we decided to publish, but it's in the statistics. So interesting. So levels of Israel bashing and anti-Semitism are relatively low in the 10 European countries, lower than what we imagined. But what we found was extraordinary. That the correlation between classical anti-Semitism and Israel bashing was off the charts. So those who are Israel bashers are 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic than the average in the population. So if bottled water by Highland Springs was 13 times more likely to cause cancer than other drinks, this would be removed from the shelves immediately, and there'd be a national inquiry how we can sell such dangerous water. So the correlation is there, and it's proven statistically strong. I'll just tell you a quick story. So this article was in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and it was the first time that we scientifically proved that there's a correlation between classical anti-Semitism and bashing or demonizing Israel. And it was in the papers. It was in the New York Times, and the Guardian. It was a whole thing. Le Monde covered the story. So my parents live in Montreal. I go home for Shabbat sometimes. So my mother is a very intelligent woman. Plays a big role in the family. Very smart, but she was married at 17, started having children at 19, didn't finish school. But she's a brilliant woman. Anyways, we go for Shabbat table, we're sitting around the table, 20 people at the table, we're having a big dinner with friends and family. Towards the end of dinner, my mother says, quiet to everybody, and she says, okay, Charles, we did the study, I tried to read the study, I don't understand it, can you explain it? So I explained the whole thing that I just explained to you. And she said, it's very interesting, and she said, how long did it take you to do the study? So I said, it took about 13, 14 months working on the study. She looked at everybody and she said, my son, the professor, it took him 14 months to prove what we all know at this stage.
That's a great story. I think we all get those sorts of stories from our parents. I think you did prove my point in the sense that there's a connection between, it isn't just Israel standing alone, it's Jews in general. But I made a note here earlier when you said that anti-Semitism is the longest lasting discrimination or bigotry. To understand that, don't you need to understand the history as well and present that to to students, or just understand it ourselves. Because if we're arguing that it's the longest lasting bigotry or discrimination, then we have to include the religious part of it, the peoplehood part, and the country part.
I agree. That's a term Robert Wistrup used. He was a great scholar on the subject. But yeah, he was a historian. And I would think, yes, we at ISGAP, I think there's a focus on the contemporary, but it's interdisciplinary, and we certainly value the great importance of history. You have to put it into historical context, as well as other contexts to grapple with it. And I think the exciting thing about this program in the 2 weeks, and I hope when we work with ISGAP, is that people are going to be coming to this subject from all sorts of disciplines, from history to Middle Eastern studies, to sociology, to African studies and histories. It's, you know, there's so many ways to look at it, and I think if we examine it from different perspectives, it will hopefully shed light on the issue. Again, I agree with your point.
My question is connected with the last one, but it will have two parts. The first part, I'd like to ask you, as I understood from your speech, you are quite skeptical on the term anti-Judaism. So we always change this term into different kinds. That is my question, why? Because this term very good tell us the characteristic of the phenomenon. So did you know that it happened and what the characteristic had? So it's one question, and another one's connected. I see that it's quite important, and it will be helpful maybe for all of us to create a timeline of different types of anti-Semitism, connect with the characteristics and with the time of period. And in your talk, I always feel that the point of view is Zionism history and Zionism as phenomenon. But I would like to ask you concerning differences. For example, in the understanding of a contemporary anti-Semitism, as I understood, it's not about the post-Holocaust situation. So it's not usual if you talk about the American society, about the Israeli society, but it's very important, for example, in the East European case or Central and East European case, and we have a period after the Holocaust, and we have anti-Semitism after the Holocaust, and it's not contemporary anti-Semitism, so it's such very specific kind of anti-Semitism relation. And I would like, what do you think about how to, it is quite easy to recognize, but how to localize it in the timetable, these things, and how it's connected to theory when you talk from the Western perspective.
Okay, thank you. So, I'll answer the second question first. So I think, I don't think my talk, I think the purpose of my talk was to try to provide a context for the start of the school, for the start of the institute. To create a context to look at globalization, to look at different forms of anti-Semitism, sort of briefly, the religious, the racist, the attack on Jewish peoplehood, in a very introductory way, and to provide a context of the contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. So certainly, looking at the history, looking at different contexts are very important. Different times, different places. How different places and different forms of anti-Semitism influence or relate to the contemporary context in different parts of the world is very important. How these ideas travel, how they're traveling, what are the impact of them, how societies or institutions engage or refuse to engage in these issues is very important. So I don't think it's a question of Zionism, but it's a question of how Jewish peoplehood is being portrayed in different spaces and places, and why, and how. And what's the impact? And what's the impact of focusing, in this case, on the victim of anti-Semitism, or the object, perhaps, of anti-Semitism? And what are the ramifications for Israel, the Jewish community in the Middle East, in Europe, and in other parts of the world? What are the implications for the conflict in the Middle East? How does the P5+1 signing agreement transfer billions of dollars? 5 days after this happened, we have a refugee crisis. What does that mean for the European context? What does that mean for Brexit? What does that mean for the future of NATO? These are all now questions that are sort of emerging. How does that affect nationalism in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe? These are all sort of questions that are beginning to emerge in this sort of global crisis. So I think it's important to situate the subject of contemporary anti-Semitism from an interdisciplinary perspective, and also certainly to learn and to study from how this is being, the ripple effect of this in different parts of the world, from Nigeria to Russia, from Russia to Argentina. What's going on? I think we should look at it from different perspectives. And perhaps anti-Semitism is an entry point into many of these global issues, perhaps. I think I'm not opposed to the term anti-Judaism. In fact, politically and perhaps at the academic level, it may be more effective than anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism as a concept is problematic because it was invented by an anti-Semite. It was invented by somebody who hated Jews and was proud of his hatred of Jews. As I say in this booklet, there's no Semitic race. These are all socially constructed, misconstrued concepts. And anti-Semitism has come to mean Jew hatred. And there are many scholars and I think political activists who will say, if you tell somebody they're anti-Jewish, there's almost a gap. When you say somebody's anti-Semitic, people are sort of saying, well, what does that mean? What is that? You say something, you tell somebody they're being anti-Jewish, maybe it's more effective. I don't know. Maybe it's more accurate. So the field of the study of this form of hatred is fraught with all sorts of issues, conceptual issues. I don't like the term Islamophobia or Judeophobia. I won't go into all the details, but I don't think that's effective or appropriate. But maybe anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism is important. Maybe. I don't dismiss it. Yeah, okay, good. So Dan will speak about this.
I would like to say about two comments. You said earlier that Sharia sees the Jew as inferior and Dhulma, like as you said, as Islamic, in scholarship in Islamic studies, also Christians are infidels in the view of Islam. Now, today, ISIS sees the Shiite, the Druze, the other minorities also as inferior infidels. The second comment about Sheikh al-Kardawi, when he said that the sentence that Hitler, what he does, even they exaggerate. So this is the Holocaust denial aspect in his speech. I wrote a book about Holocaust denial in the Arab world lately. It will be published soon, I hope. In Israel, I wrote, a part of the book is about PLO Mahmoud Abbas. He has his thesis, his PhD doctorate based on conspiracy theory that the Jewish cooperated with Adolf Hitler. The Holocaust is a conspiracy. That's my book about it. No institution in Israel accepted to publish one paper about this subject. No institute. Academic, non-academic, everyone was afraid. They told me, I thought maybe get money funds from, it's political issue, it's nothing, it's about only Holocaust denial and about his book. So this is regarding the political correctness that we spoke today.
Professor Small, I'm very grateful for your intervention in the subject. You are sort of pioneered it, actually undertook very large project, multi-volume project, yeah, about anti-Semitism, 4 or more volumes, yeah, right now, but nowadays.
The more what, sorry?
You undertook big research project which actually resulted in publication of several volumes.
Yes.
But I'd like to mention some maybe miscorrections, or it seems to me as sound miscorrection. For instance, you emphasize several times or put attention on similarity between Iranian Revolution and Muslim or Islamist experiences in the Arabian world. I think it's not correct, because Iranian Revolution was very specific project actually. It was actually, it damaged the fundamentals of Islam and in Shia version as well, actually. Because you, maybe you know, certainly know that the leaders of Shia community in Iran actually will not agree with the Ayatollah Khomeini, actually. And their notion, I mean, Khomeini notion of anti-Semitism was very different, actually. I think it was based on some historical things, civilizational things, and not like regular things, older things, like in current Arabian, which are connected to the conflicts of 40s and 30s and so on, Palestine problem and so on. Actually, Iranian events in late 70s preceded this ideal Islamic State. It was out of game actually. And right now they are not in alliance actually. Arabian states, which are also anti-Semitic, and Iran as well. Should be very distinctive. An explanation as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I agree with you in principle, but I have to say two quick things. So the ideologues that were in exile in France, that later became Khomeini and the Iranian revolutionary regime, they owe their intellectual debt on their perception of the Jew to the Muslim Brotherhood. There's been some articles written on how the revolutionaries from Iran borrowed from the Muslim Brotherhood and other Sunni intellectuals about their perceptions of the Jew, and they incorporated the anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the sort of Muslim Brotherhood / Hamas Europeanized notion of the Jew, the anti-Semitic European notion of the Jew. And Khomeini, and I have the books, they were translated into English, and I've been reading them recently, and the title escapes me, but one of his most important writings while he was in exile, which was published when he came back to Iran triumphantly, the first 10 pages of this very, very important book on his speeches is dedicated to the Jew. The Jew as the quintessential enemy of not only the Iranian Revolution, but of Islam itself, and that the Islam, the Jews, the Judaism and Jews were conspiring to destroy Islam. And it's, I'll get you the title, I hope, I'll Google it tonight, but this is the anti-Semitism in the Iranian revolutionary regime, in Ayatollah Khomeini, in the intellectual vanguard of the revolution, is permanent and consistent and owes gratitude to the Sunni Islamists. So that's the sort of intellectual circle, if you will. But of course, there's a great divide between the Sunni and Shiite world now, and Saudi Arabia and Iran are at, I don't know if they're at war directly, but through their proxies now, there's a very dangerous conflict underway and potentially being exacerbated. So,
because you remember that the first major enemy was the United States, and the second was the Soviet Union. What's Israel the third one? Please estimate, Iranian estimate.
so the first enemy was
The United States, second was Soviet Union. What about
so Israel is perceived as a stain on the garment of Islam. You know, one of the things that we have to remember is that in the Islamic world, the only non-Muslim with self-determination in the Islamic, in quotations, world is Israel. There's no others that have self-determination in that region. The Jew are the only nation with self-determination in the region. So the perception of Israel and the Jew as the colonial outpost, as the foreign entity, the stain on the garment of Islam, as Ayatollah Khomeini referred to the entity, is deep and significant. Okay, so we're going to end there. We're going to turn things over to Mr. Long.
All right.
So thank you.
Okay, if you just want to stand and stretch for a second, feel free to do it because, you know, I know we've been sitting down quite a bit, so if you want to stand and stretch, feel free to do so. And, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, just like, I didn't say leave, I just said stand and stretch. So, all right, so and that's a good little chunk of time for us to begin to deal with some of what we have been doing already. That is, I would like for us to attempt to build bridges between the conversations that we've begun to have since we've arrived, just to continue with what we have been doing before. For instance, we said that we were going to honor what was done last night in terms of the film and the processing of it. So I thought that perhaps we should begin to think about doing that in just a moment. But I also want to honor some of the other things that we've talked about in terms of the professor pack. And so we're going to get to each of the items that we have without overloading you or making you feel put on the spot or anything like that. I know that people are at varying levels with what they've been able to produce thus far. So we're going to, again, make it as comfortable as possible because the whole point is simply to support you, to meet you where you are and to support, so that we can also build with more intentionality. I had a really interesting conversation as we were coming in from lunch, in fact, because Stephen mentioned something, if you don't mind my sharing. And it was about, well, you know, he had been working on his syllabus, but then he said, well, you know, let me, rather than paraphrase, why don't you tell the group what you told me?
I spent an ungodly amount of time on the syllabus, and I wanted it to be just right. And then after listening to you yesterday, or this morning,
Yeah.
the time,
Yeah.
it dawned on me, I included no videos. And Charles, you have tons of videos out there, YouTube, you can find them on YouTube, that I should have included, and it didn't dawn on me.
Mm-hmm.
So the first lesson I learned from this event is to put video on.
Yes, and it's great. So the whole idea is, so when you said that, I was just delighted because the whole purpose of our mentioning RVLs in the template was just to help everyone to make it more conscious, much more intentional. That's a way of almost running a check on myself, because the pattern very often, I mean, how many of us came up with the idea of, you know, you got your syllabus from your professor and said required reading, you know, recommended reading? Yeah, can I just get by a show of hands in terms of like, that's pretty much been your world? Anything different is there anything that was on your syllabus when you were coming up in college that's not on most people's syllabi? Is there anything that was unusual? Or did that pretty much sum it up along with their, you know, the exams that will be coming out, the papers and things like that? Is there anything that was novel?
Now, videos, instead of taking up time in class to show a video, we can stream it over the university server, and students can log on and watch it at home and not take up class time. The bad thing there is you don't get class discussion. But on the other side of the coin, I show no videos without ancillary materials. That they have to take notes and answer questions, and then they come into class and we discuss it based on the notes.
Okay. So one of the things that we're going to want to do is just add to the sense of intentionality with regard to our use of speeches, videos, clips, any other kind of text. In preparation for that, I'd like to have you just share for a moment, and then we're going to set up the video. I'd like you to just share with just a quick turn and talk with the person next to you in terms of your own instruction. What have been the kind of strategies you have tended to embed in your syllabus? You know, what are the things that you've tended to do? I think one of the prompts I asked you to consider was basically to reflect on your own pedagogy. Like, what are things that you do? Do you tend to lecture more? Can you just turn and talk with the person next to you just for about 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, just to chat with the person next to you or around you, and just share what, in terms of your own reflection on what you do in the classroom. Can you just chat, just for a few minutes? Thank you everybody for coming back together. So we're going to, thank you for processing that and sharing. It was really interesting just hearing the lilt in the room. We're going to go to, for tea, but before we do so, is there any one thing or that really stuck out? Is there something that really stood out in terms of something that you said or something that you heard? Do we have one or two people just to share something, and then we'll go off to tea? Anybody, something that either you said or heard? Oh, okay. Okay.
If you want.
Okay. All right. Anybody want to?
I was talking about the fact that I teach quite a few online courses, e-learning, and it made me a better face-to-face instructor, professor. I came out of the school of pretty much lecturing, and you can't do that in e-learning. You have to give, I found that students were engaged in more active learning online because they had to do stuff. They didn't have to just sit in class. And I brought much of what I do online into the classroom and made it, and I'm happier for it. I learned to be a better in-class or face-to-face instructor by being an online instructor.
And what was it that you brought into? What was it that you carried?
Well, I give the assignments that students have to do are much more they're much more engaged in doing it. They have to go out and whatever it is, go to the library or whatever paper they're writing or research or reading, that I would hold them to task. But what I wasn't at my institution, we have very few classes online where the instructor is actually lecturing. So they have to read and be held accountable for what they read. So whether I give them online weekly quizzes or papers, they're always actively doing something, not just sitting in class listening to a lecture waiting for the midterm. So I brought more active learning. I give more, more papers that they have to hand in on a weekly basis. We have more discussions. We films, as I may have mentioned earlier. I give them questions to answer, but like I would do online. Because I would give them a YouTube video to watch, and so I would know they watched it, and we'd have some sort of asynchronous discussion. They would have to answer questions and post the answers.
So you're engaging them more with the technology.
I don't know how it works.
Okay, yeah, Glenn?
Yeah, I was just saying that I also come from a grad school tradition that was very much lecturing, especially in France. And I started teaching in Greece. In the first semester, I started off lecturing, and I realized that the students were not, let's say, as active or responsive as I thought they could be. And so I quickly shifted modes, and because all the classrooms are smart classrooms, I started using PowerPoints, which have some videos integrated into them, and it was much more, they became much more responsive. I think it's, especially if you're teaching first and second year students, it's a very visual, my experience at least, it's a very visual generation. They love videos, pictures, anything that's a visual. That doesn't mean that we have to turn ourselves into entertainers. It's possible that some kids, their attention span is so short that, it's almost futile, but there are a lot, there are a lot who I think can at least benefit from a supplement of a nice dose of visual material.
All right, great. And it's so interesting you say that, Glenn, because there's some research on the whole notion of digital natives and digital immigrants. And it's really kind of fascinating that if you're above 30, you're pretty much considered a digital immigrant, and kind of under 30 is a digital native. And you can see the metaphor, right? That those who are immigrants are new to this land, and they are not necessarily fluent, and they're struggling, and they know what they want to do, but they don't necessarily know how to do it. They need sometimes a Sherpa to say, oh, well, you have to press send here, So it's like that kind of thing in terms of the digital and the digital natives and the digital immigrants. So that's just something to play around with the idea that so many of the folks who are under 30 have been awash with technology from birth. Almost,
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't do PowerPoint. I don't know how to do PowerPoint. I could get somebody to create it. And I feel old-fashioned in a sense, except for the fact that we do have in the United States a phenomenon called Trump. And part of what's driving it are people who need to be entertained, have a 2-second attention span, and can't keep too much information in their minds, especially if it gets too complex. So for me now, the question isn't just, well, am I old-fashioned? Or is this one of the old bastions that we do have to hold on to?
Yes.
That we can't water it down?
Yes.
And I've read, I don't have evidence for it, but I remember reading the New York Times once, that there's certain schools in Silicon Valley where the parents themselves are all high-tech people, and there's no technology in school at all, no computers, nothing. The kids are all hands-on, having to read and so forth.
Yes, and we must be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's part of the concern, right? Because the issue of literacy, to be able to engage a unit of meaning, or from which one can at least extract or attempt to extract meaning or infer meaning or make meaning, right, is a process. And so the engagement of the students in critical thinking skills would be crucial to help them to navigate the technology which they're awash with. Because we still have students who are awash with technology, but if they don't know the different critical thinking skills, they can't sequence, they can't make metaphors, they can't create analogies or classify or sequence or compare and contrast.
Or right.
Right, right. Or engage the vocabulary, right? Someone talked about a student who complained about the word malicious as being not being above their pay grade. I dealt with a student, I dealt with a student at a college which will remain nameless, and I was just passing through, so I wasn't a part of this institution, but I was there to help the institution. And one of the students said to me when we were talking about really pushing the vocabulary, enhancing the understanding of etymology, and enhancing the understanding of language and connections between words and concepts and declinations of verbs and conjugations and all this. The student said, Professor, I don't want to sound too college-y. Now, the upset part of me was going to say, you don't have to worry about that. But the caring, nurturing part of me had to, I had to go to my higher angels, my higher nature, and say, yeah, well, we have to work on that. And these are a bunch of reasons why you have to sound more collegiate. Yeah.
Sometimes I take the approach where I have this information that I want you to know, and that the students use the technology as their form of processing to demonstrate that they learn what I was trying to teach. So I actually don't know how to use the stuff. But then they laugh at me, so I guess that makes me more humane that I don't know how to do it. But then when they reproduce, so like for example, I have a university-wide course that they learn the history of the university. And so they have to make an Instagram page details every leader and artifacts of that leader's work. And they have to take a selfie. And it has to be in sequence, you know, so something that was educational, something that was structural, like they build a building. You know. And so now they have to do a great deal of research to compile that information, but the final really said make an Instagram page with 30 pics. And so they laughed at my Instagram shortcoming, but they actually learned the stuff, processed it, and then delivered it in the language that they speak.
I have to learn Instagram to take your course.
Yeah. So we'll take one last comment, then we're going to go on to for T.
Kind of to pull some of the threads together in a nice surprise. As part of the World War 45 course, I had the students look at every ISIS magazine. There are only like 10 or so. Beautiful color layout, for the sake of becoming aware of the type of material that they were encounter in researching what this was about. And what I discovered was that my fear that they wouldn't be able to work their way through the high tech was completely misplaced. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. Because they are so accustomed to expecting high tech, high levels of sophistication, that they took it in tow that it was propaganda. And my fears were misplaced, that because it was so sophisticated that it would draw them in fact, was on their level, and they said no. So it's sort of a curious backward setting from what perhaps my generation would have experienced. If we saw something that was that sophisticated, we make certain assumptions about it being correct. They, on the other hand, don't.
I'm glad you mentioned high tech. It's going to be a great segue for when we come back, because I'm going to talk about low tech. Okay, and then we'll deal with our video. Okay, so why don't we go for tea? And thanks everybody. That's great.